Hello everyone, and welcome to the North Georgia GMRS Information and Instructional Video segment. I am Atlanta 750 WRMR 367, and my name is Jeff. Today we're going to do a brief unboxing as well as a detailed initial setup of the Anytone D578 UV Pro. The Pro model is a Part 90 certified radio, so we can use it on the North Georgia GMRS network. Chatt Radio let us borrow this radio for the purposes of the video. At the conclusion of this video, the code plug you learn to install will remain in the radio. This exact radio may be purchased from Chatt Radio with the code plug already installed as a plug-and-play setup at the 2023 Stone Mountain Hamfest this coming weekend. Chatt Radio is an approved vendor for our network and will make sure that you get what you need to get your station set up correctly. So please help support those who support us. To recap, the unboxing will be brief as I'm sure most of you already know how to open your new toys. But I want to at least show you what it comes with so there are no surprises. The initial setup is a little confusing, so that's what we're going to focus on. If there are enough requests and interest, I may do additional videos getting into specifics of the software and building code plugs. But for now, let's get your new toy on the air. Alright, so as you can see, we have the Pro model here, the 578, which is the Anytone mobile version, and the Pro model is the only one that is Part 90 certified. So let's open the box and let's see what it comes with. Alright, so we got some stickers here. A warning regarding the firmware update of the radio, which we'll get into that a little bit later once we hook up our computer to it. We have the Bluetooth setup guide, and don't go looking for this Bluetooth module because that is already installed in the radio. And of course, the operator's manual. We have our mobile install bracket, and I'm going to open this side panel here on the right first, because they kind of tuck the power cable for the radio in there, and it's hard to get it out of the box if you don't do that first. So here's the power pigtail coming off the back of the radio. On this flap, you will see your microphone hanger, power cord, charger cord for the Bluetooth PTT button, little Velcro strap for the PTT button, some spare fuses and hardware, and a programming cable. I'm going to use my own programming cable and my own power cable so I don't have to undo all this packaging. So we'll nestle all this stuff back in the box here. On the left side, we have our GPS antenna for APRS and GPS, as well as obviously the microphone. The microphone, again, I'm going to use mine from my radio so we can leave this all packaged up nice and neat. So, as most Part 90 commercial radios, you'll notice that most of the radio is heatsink. We're trying to dissipate heat from a Part 90 radio, as with Kenwood and ICOM and others. There's a fan on the back to pull heat away from the heatsink, your antenna connector. Then on the other side, under this little rubber flap, we have a external speaker hookup and we have our little antenna hookup for the GPS antenna. So I'm going to power up this radio, and we'll get a programming cable hooked up to it, and we'll start getting into the setup of it. Alright, well, we got the radio powered up. I have a microphone plugged in. The microphone is right here. And you'll notice that the menu and exit buttons are on the microphone that I have plugged into it, which match the buttons that are on the face of the radio. The programming cable plugs in under this little rubber flap here to the left, which I do have hooked up to my computer at the moment. The first thing it's going to ask us for is to set the clock and the time zone. So we're going to spin this knob right here on the right, which is normally going to be your channel select knob. Here in Georgia, our time zone is UTC -5. So UTC -5, we are going to push the channel select button to move down to the next line. The year is 2023. Again, push it to move to the next selection. We are in October, and it is October 29th. At 2 2:28. So now you noticed I pushed the channel select button again, which this is a knob and a button, and we jumped back up to UTC-5. To confirm what we have so far, we're going to push the menu button, and you'll notice the Power Works and the Anytone screen will come up. The screen automatically by default says Anytone D578 UV3, even though it's not a UV3. Okay, so here's the default screen. You'll notice a bunch of icons at the top for Bluetooth, and the H in the square lets you know what power the radio is set to. And we have channel 1 and zone 1. Again, I'm using the buttons on the microphone so as not to have my fingers in your face. So if we push the menu button, it's going to tell us key locked. If we push any of the buttons, it's going to tell us key locked. As with most Part 90 radios from the factory, they are going to be locked and require programming software to unlock the radio and initialize them, which this is where the confusing part comes in. So we have the radio set up with the date and time and the time zone, but it's locked out and we can't do anything with it. The most important part of these Anytone radios is that the programming software you use matches the firmware that's already in the radio. So there's a couple different ways to go about this, and sometimes the information is in the radio and accessible, but if the keypad's locked, we can't get to it. So there's a couple different ways we can go about this. If you have the Anytone Options software, we can open the Anytone Options software, and it's going to give us this warning saying you cannot use this software if the power on password is set. Well, this radio is brand new in the box and it shouldn't have a power on password. So we're going to hit yes. Right now, Anytone Options is telling us that there's no COM port selected and none of these fields are filled in because it hasn't read the radio yet. So I already have my programming cable plugged into the radio and the computer. So I'm going to select a COM port, which in this case the only one it allows me to select is COM port 4 because it knows that that's where the radio is. So we're going to read the radio. Anytone Options comes up and says read complete. So we know the radio type is a D578 UV. It is currently set to a band mode of 0 with the serial number and the production date of May of 2022. Sometimes the software will be listed in these windows and tell you what software and firmware version is already in the radio. In this case, we weren't very lucky and that's not there. So Anytone Options is a good thing to have because some manufacturers, some vendors do not have the radio in the box with the correct band. For GMRS, we need band 0, which is a commercial band that is set to wideband use. So we are going to put the radio into commercial mode and allow it to operate at wideband for GMRS. Okay, so based on the production date of the radio, I'm going to guess that the software version is 1.17. And why I'm guessing at 1.17 is based on the production date, because we don't know what software level is in the radio at this time. So this is going to be a similar process of what we did with the Anytone Options. We're going to set our COM port. The only selection it's going to give us is 4. Then we're going to program and read from the radio. Current content has been changed, save them, or not. In this case, we're just going to say no. And we want to read the data from the radio. So after we read the data from the radio is going to reboot. We have only read the radio at this time. We haven't done anything else. But if you push the buttons, you'll notice that the radio is still locked. So we're going to go back to the programming software. We're going to go to optional settings. Under key function, which is the programmable buttons that we can set for this radio, we're going to go to keyboard lock, off, side key lock, off, and forced lock key, off. That's it. We are just changing those 3 for right now. We're going to select OK. We're going to go to program, and we're going to write that back to the radio. So we're hitting OK. You notice the screen changes. It's copying the data to the radio. On our computer software, it says write data complete, but the radio hasn't finished processing that data. When it does, it will reboot as it's doing right now. It takes a minute. So now, all we have done to this radio is simply tell it to unlock our keypad. So now with the keypad unlocked, I can go into the menu. Again, we're going to use the channel knob. And go into our settings. We can push the channel select knob to select that. Then we can go to device info. Again, hit select. And now it's going to tell you all the information that's in the radio. For right this minute, the only thing we're concerned about is that firmware version. The firmware version that you see on the radio is 1.15. That firmware version has to match the programming software for what we're doing. So that means we need to use the CPS software of 1.15. So I guessed on the software version because the keypad was locked, which I guessed wrong. I guessed with 1.17, but the radio, now that the keypad is unlocked, tells us it has 1.15 in it. So, where do we get the correct software that we need? PowerWorks is the importer of Anytone radios into the United States. If we go to the PowerWorks website and we go to Help and Software Downloads, you'll notice that for the D578 UV Pro and Plus, the only version that they have is 1.19. So to use this software, we would have to upgrade the firmware in the radio. But that's a whole nother video that we need to get into as far as upgrading the firmware in the radio. So to get older versions of the software, in this case we're looking for 1.15. If we go to the Bridgecom Systems website instead, go to Support, and then under Product Support for Anytone 578, and we click on CPS and Firmware Downloads, you will notice that they have all the older versions of the software. So for this particular radio, we need the version 1.15, which I have downloaded here. So we'll go ahead and open version 1.15 of the programming software for the D578. You can see all that information at the top. So we are going to go ahead, set our COM port, now that we have the correct software, and we're going to read the radio. The current contact has been changed, save them or not. In this case, it's just as we opened the software, so we don't really care. We're just trying to read the radio. We don't need to save these at this point. We're going to read the data from the radio. We want to read everything from the radio. So digital contact list and other data. Hit OK. So now we've read everything from the radio, including setup, settings, digital contacts, analog contacts, and anything that had that was stored in that radio. For me, it is always good practice to save the information you pulled out of that radio. In case you ever have an issue, you can resort back to that. So we're going to go ahead and name this as Chatt Radio D578 New. That way we have a version of the new file that came with that radio, and we're going to save it. If we ever have an issue or need to resort to the programming that came with that radio when it was new, we now have that file saved. So I'm going to save you the trouble of watching me painstakingly enter in line by line of software and code plugs, and we are going to go here and find our North Georgia GMRS file for version 1.15, and we're going to open it. So now you'll see that I've already entered in all the North Georgia GMRS repeaters, as well as some simplex channels and some other channels. And we'll get into that in just a minute of how exactly to add channels. But first and most importantly, with this new radio, I think it's important to set up your optional settings first. Your optional settings are going to be what controls the radio, what it does, making sure we don't have Roger beeps or any of those kinds of things. So I always start in the power on segment, and we'll just walk through it, and I'll pause on each screen and give you a brief synopsis of what each screen is telling us. So if you remember from the Anytone Options earlier in the video, it told us to make sure that we don't have a power on password. So in the power on section of the settings, I like to keep mine off just to make sure that if I need to get into the radio with the Anytone Options, I can, because it's not password locked. So that's what I change. Make sure that's off. And also here, if you do not want the default Power Works screen when you first turn the radio on, you can go ahead and enter your call sign and whatever other little power-up message you'd like to appear on the screen when you first turn the radio on. Alert tone is nothing that we want for North Georgia GMRS. So we want to make sure the SMS alerts and all these other tones and settings here are all turned off so that we don't have Roger beeps or transmitting tones with our audio. In display, the brightness, we have the menu exit times. So when you push the menu button, if you're trying to select through, if you pause for any length of time, that's going to be how long it takes before it exits itself out of the menu and goes back to the normal screen. Time display is whether or not it shows the time on the screen of the radio. And a lot of these other settings here, call display mode, call sign display, those are for DMR functions that we're not going to be using for GMRS anyways. Up here in the top right, your channel A and channel B are the colors that you wish the text to be written in, and then the zone colors that those channels are stored in, and we'll get back to that in just a minute. So your other settings here for time slot and color codes and those kinds of things, again, are for DMR. We don't need them for GMRS. And then the format that you would like the date to be displayed in the volume bar for how far the volume is turned up. Me personally, I like to leave that on because the volume knobs are infinite. There is no set stop points for minimum and maximum. So if you have the volume bar displayed on the screen, you can see exactly how loud or where in the scale from minimum to maximum your volume is currently set to. GPS is, again, with the antenna that comes with the radio. And if you would like the radio to use GPS functions, and the radio is also capable of doing APRS functions, neither of which we would like to use for GMRS purposes, so I have all those turned off as well. VFO scan is if you're in VFO mode, which we are not going to use for GMRS purposes. Auto repeater offset is if you want the radio to automatically use your offset for GMRS purposes, it would be a 5 megahertz positive offset. But I prefer to enter the frequencies in manually, so I leave those off as well. Your personal preference, if you'd like to use it, that's where those settings are. The radio has the ability to record audio, both from your voice and its receiving audio. Not really a function I'm interested in using, but it is there if you'd like it. If we go to the volume and audio tab, the maximum volume, regardless of where you set the volume knob to, has a setting. I personally leave it in the code plug as all the way up and then adjust the volume accordingly with the volume knob on the face of the radio. Digital mic gain would be for DMR, not really useful for us on GMRS. Enhanced sound quality is also a DMR function. The microphone that comes with this radio is a very hot microphone. You're going to want to set the analog microphone gain to 1. And if you're a very quiet talker, you might need to bump it up from there, but I would recommend starting with the initial setup of this radio with the gain at 1. Digital functions, again, are for DMR. These are all your DMR settings, which we're not going to be using for GMRS. And then we get into the other tab. The other tab, we have our timeout timer settings, timeout timer rekey times, timeout timer predict, which means it will give you an audible alert if you're getting close to your timeout timer. I have mine set to 120 seconds. You can set yours to whatever you wish, but that's where I keep mine, especially in a mobile setup. I don't really like going much more than 2 minutes and risk the radio overheating based on where it's located in my vehicle. I've found the squelch levels to be pretty darn close at 2, so I have channel A and channel B, and we will get back to channel A and channel B here in just a minute, of the squelch setting to be at 2. Then over here we have our microphone speaker path, whether it's the main channel or the sub channel if the audio comes out of the microphone speaker. Fan open is when the fan on the back of the radio turns on. You can set it to go by the internal thermometer, and it'll only turn the fan on based on temperature. Or you can set the fan to only turn on with the PTT button. I prefer to leave mine to both. So the fan's going to come on as soon as I hit that PTT button, and it's also going to come on and stay on if the radio starts getting warm. Speaker mode allows you to set if you're going to hear your receive audio from this little speaker in the microphone or the speaker on the body of the radio itself. I prefer to just listen to it from the body of the radio. Again, your mileage may vary, and set that however you wish. Encryption type, obviously we can't use encryption for GMRS, so you can leave that at its default. And weather channel, the radio has the ability to set up weather channels. If you'd like to use them, then you would select the appropriate weather channel for your area. Hand mic mode is if you wish to use a microphone other than the factory microphone that comes with it, you would have to change that to level detection. But because we're just using the factory Anytone microphone, we're going to leave that at serial port because the radio needs to talk to the microphone through the serial port built into it. Key function. Key function, this is all of the buttons on both the face and the microphone can be programmed however you wish. I'm going to leave this screen up here for just a minute, and it might be a little bit of a long, awkward pause, but you can set these however you want. There are dozens and dozens and dozens of options. I found this to be the most useful setup, especially in a mobile, because then you can change things on the fly from the buttons on the microphone without having to actually look at the screen while you're driving. So the radio has the ability to do channel A and channel B because the radio has 2 receivers built into it. So it's a true dual receive radio. By setting channel A to mute or channel B to mute with the buttons on the microphone, if you are talking and engaged in conversation on one of those channels and then there's traffic on the second channel, you may want to mute that second channel and continue talking because otherwise it's going to be all jumbled up and you'll hear both conversations at the same time. So I like to put those buttons right on my microphone where they're quick and easy to get to. So if I'm engaged in a conversation, I can mute one and still continue to hear the second one. And then again, I have the mute buttons also on the face of the radio so that you can mute it from the face or the microphone. Zone up and down is also on the face of the radio as well as the microphone. That's why it's in here twice. So the PB and PC are buttons on the microphone, whereas P4 and P5 are on the face of the radio. So here's the settings that I like to run for programmable functions. Again, your mileage may vary. This is not an end-all be-all. Any of these buttons are subject to your personal preference and will not affect the operation of the radio on GMRS. Power save functions, you can set the radio to automatically shut down after a set period of time. I don't like to use that function, but it may be something you're interested in if you're in a mobile setup and you do not have a keyed ignition source to shut the radio down. The radio is capable of AM and FM receive for regular over-the-air band radio. If you'd like to set that up, that's where you would do that. STE is a signaling tone that we do not use on GMRS, so those are going to be set to off. Bluetooth, you noticed when I opened up the package of the radio with the initial unboxing, it came with a Bluetooth push-to-talk button. This radio has the ability to talk to Bluetooth headsets, or in some cases on some vehicles it can talk to the Bluetooth in your vehicle for hands-free, and then you would use the Bluetooth push-to-talk button and then use the microphone and speakers that come with your vehicle for hands-free. So that's where those settings are right here. I have mine set to off, but if that's something you wish to change and hook up to the hands-free in your vehicle, or maybe you have a Bluetooth headset from your cell phone, those are things that you may want to set up and turn on and pair with your devices. Work mode is another important menu section. To be in Part 90 compliance, we need to change this bottom one to professional mode. The sub-channels and main channels can be turned on or off, and we'll get back to that in just a minute. Once we enter this code plug into the radio, I will explain what some of these functions do. So for now, as far as setting up the radio, we're going to set our COM port, because I already built this code plug out. We're going to set the COM port, which of course is going to be number 4. We're going to hit OK. And we're going to write it to the radio. It's going to ask us, are we sure we want to write it to the radio? And of course we do. So we are going to send this information back to the radio, and you'll see how the radio responds with this multi-view. And you're going to see that in some cases, we'll go back to the computer, in some cases, not always, it'll say the radio ID list is empty and it cannot be written. Okay, so for GMRS, we're not using a radio ID list, but that is under the digital section. For GMRS, we don't need digital, but because this is a DMR capable radio, it forces you to enter one. So if we go to the digital tab and hit the plus sign so all the menus drop down, here's our radio ID list. We're going to double click on that first one. For radio ID, we're just going to do 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And we'll just leave it as radio 1. So now you see we have a radio ID list with radio 1. Again, we're not going to be using this for GMRS, but for the purposes of putting a code plug in these radios, it kind of forces you to put one in. So now if we go back to channel mode, you're going to see that the radio ID is kind of grayed out. It's not black like the rest of the channels are. It's grayed out because it does not apply to analog channels, but it forces us to put one in. So we did. So now if we go back to the right to the radio, we're going to say OK. And we're going to write all this data to the radio. Again, you'll see the face of the radio say PC write. The computer screen says write data completed, but the radio is still processing the information and writing it to its internal memory. It's going to reboot. And that would be the screen that you would change if you wanted to put your call sign in. So when we were going through the menu options, we had channel A, channel B, mute, and now you see where that comes into play. Because now we have repeaters on the top and simplex on the bottom. So we can set our volume levels accordingly for the bottom channel, which is channel B, and we can set the volume for channel A, which in this case is set to repeaters. So let's go back to the software and we'll dive into that a little bit and show you exactly what's going on. So we have all the repeaters programmed in for North Georgia GMRS, as well as the simplex channels for GMRS, which are all these. And then we have the repeater input frequencies that we have set up to monitor. With a digital radio, it forces you to put your channels in a zone. So we have all our channels put in, but then we have to go to zone. So if we go to zone, you'll see I have 3 set up. I have repeaters with all the North Georgia GMRS repeaters stored in there for that zone. Then I have simplex with the 22 GMRS simplex channels stored in there. And then I have the repeater inputs in their own separate zone. So there's only 8 of those because there's only 8 repeater pairs. And that, much like the radio ID, we double click. We can call the zone whatever we want, and then put whatever channels we want to put in that zone. So if we wanted to create a zone for the Chattanooga region, we'll just call it Chat. And then we can scroll down here and we can put Cades Cove, White Oak Mountain, Chattanooga, Georgetown, Ottawa. We'll put Fort Mountain and Lookout Mountain in there as well. So now you see we added these channels. If we hit OK, there we have another zone called Chat with 7 channels in it. So now you're saying, well, that's great. You programmed all these channels in ahead of time, but how do we do this? It's very easy. We'll go down here and double click on the first available open channel, and we'll just call this one Flagship 2 because there's already a flagship in there. So our receive frequency on flagship is 462.675. Our transmit frequency on flagship is 467.675. Channel type is going to be analog for GMRS. We'll leave the power set to high. Bandwidth for the flagship repeater is obviously going to be wideband, so we're going to select wideband. Busy lock, as well as these other settings that are grayed out, are going to be with regard to DMR radio. We're not using DMR, we're just using simple analog for flagship. So the DMR mode lets us select it, but is really useless in this case because it's an analog channel. So for flagship, we need our tones, which are DCS tones. So we're going to switch that to DCS. And then for flagship, it's going to be a long scroll down to 114N. And we're going to set the tones for our receive and transmit so that they're both there and we limit the amount of traffic we hear. So right here, we have our tones set for receive and transmit. However, the squelch mode for that channel is set to carrier. So even though we have the tone set for decode, which would be our receive, it's only going to open the squelch if it sees a carrier, and it's not going to pay attention to that tone. So if we want the squelch to only open when that tone is there, we're going to change this squelch mode to CTCSS/DCS, which means now it's only going to open our squelch if it sees the correct tone coming from flagship. Then if we hit OK, you'll see the channel added there as flagship 2. And then for that channel, if we want it in the radio, we'll have to go back to zone in repeaters. And if we scroll down to the bottom, there's our flagship 2, which is not in the zone yet. So we'll have to add that to the zone so that when we're operating our radio, it will show up. And now you see the repeater change to quantity of 22 channels for that zone. So adding a channel is very easy. Just got to remember to make sure you add it to the zone. Now, if you want to set up a scan list, again, we go to the first available spot and double click on it. So we're going to call this scan list simplex. We're going to scroll down, and we're just going to throw the higher power simplex channels in there so that we have them. So there's different settings here, which would be your preference for priority scan, whether you want it on or off, and channel 1 or channel 2. And you'll also notice that down at the bottom here in this white box, it's going to give us a description for what those settings do for us. So revert to channel, you'll see right now it's as selected, but if I drop on the drop down menu, it tells us what all these different functions do to help give you a better idea of which way you'd like to program it. So we'll just leave it as the default for the purposes of this demonstration and hit OK. Now you'll see simplex with 8 channels, scan mode, and the delay times and drop and look back times. If we go back to channel here, and then our simplex channels for 550, we have to go back into each channel and put in the scan list of simplex. If we do not do that, it will not show up. For those of you that are building out the code plug from the beginning, I would recommend building out one channel, adding it to your scan list, and then for the future channels that you build out, your simplex scan list will be there to select for each additional channel. So if you want 10 or 20 channels in that particular scan list, I recommend building that scan list first and then go in and do your 10 or 20 channels. That way the drop down menu is there for you to select. If you don't do those two steps, when you go to scan with the radio, that channel will not show up in the scan list. So that's a nutshell of how the programming software works. Again, this is meant to get your radio set up initially and get you on the air, not necessarily a detailed, fully involved setup of what all of the programming software can do for us. So I'm going to delete this second flagship because we don't need to. And we're going to switch back to the radio and see what the radio now can do for us. So I'm using the microphone to control it. You'll notice there is an up and a down button on the very top of the microphone. The up and the down button will select the channel for the zone that you are in. So the top zone, you can see it says repeaters in the white letters, or channel A as it's called in the programming software. And then channel B is our simplex zone in the white letters at the bottom. The channel you are actively going to talk on if you key up the radio is going to be the one in bigger letters. So in this case, if I was monitoring ball ground and simplex at the same time, but wanted to talk on simplex, I would simply push that AB button to the left-hand side of the microphone, and you'll notice that the simplex zone just got bigger as far as its text size go. We have ample lighting in Studio Vanguard here, so you can't really see it, but the buttons, the little AB buttons on the top right-hand corner of the microphone will switch corresponding to whether you have channel A or channel B selected. So at this point, let's go back to the repeaters, and I'm not interested in talking on flagship right now. I'm not interested in talking on ball ground right now. I'd like to talk on flagship because flagship's a linked repeater. So if I push the buttons on the top, meaning the very top of the microphone, we can scroll through that zone up and down and select the channel we're looking for. So currently you will see the screen for flagship in big letters with the H in the square box at the top left corner of the screen. So if I push the talk button right now, I will be on flagship repeater on high power. Well, while I'm engaged in a conversation on flagship, suppose there's chatter on the simplex channel, which would be sub channel or channel B, depending on where you are in the programming software, that you may not want to hear. Well, the way we programmed our buttons, if we push and hold C on the microphone, it will mute that channel. And there we go. Volume B is mute. So now if I'm talking on flagship, even if there's traffic on that simplex channel for channel B, I won't hear it. It will light up the receive light, but we won't hear the traffic. So if we'd like to return and unmute channel B, it's simply just push and hold the C button again. So these buttons are programmable. That is just how I like to have mine programmed. You can change them however you wish, but I find it convenient to have the mute buttons right on the radio, right on the microphone and the radio. So a short press of an A will bring us into the menu. A short press of D will exit the menu. And then we can use B and C with a short press to toggle through the zones that we've created. And then obviously for B and C, if we push and hold, it will mute the channel A and channel B respectively. So that sums up this radio in a nutshell as far as initial setup, initial programming, and I hope this helps. If there's any information that I can help you get this radio programmed, I'd be more than happy to do so. Again, this wasn't meant to be a super detailed video on the ins and outs of the whole radio specifically. It was to set it up for GMRS purposes, so there was no DMR or no other functions that we're going to be using for GMRS. So that is all I went over to get the radio unlocked, get your code plug in it so that you can get that radio on the air, which is ultimately what any of us strive to do when we get a new radio right out of the box. So thanks again to Chatt Radio, and thanks for watching. Don't forget to like and subscribe, please. We are North Georgia GMRS, and I am Atlanta 750 WRMR 367, and my name is Jeff. And I hope this helped you get your radio on the air real soon.